The Reconstruction of Religious Thought in Islam by Dr. Muhammad Iqbal. Lecture 2: The Philosophical Test of the Revelations of Religious Experience. Passing now to other levels of experience, life, and consciousness. Consciousness may be imagined as a deflection from life. Its function is to provide a luminous point in order to enlighten the forward rush of life. It is a case of tension, a state of self concentration, by means of which life manages to shut out all memories and associations which have no bearing on a present action. It has no well defined fringes. It shrinks and expands as the occasion demands. To describe it as an epiphenomenon of the processes of matter is to deny it as an independent activity, and to deny it as an independent activity is to deny the validity of all knowledge, which is only a systematized expression of consciousness. Thus, consciousness is a variety of purely spiritual principle of life, which is not a substance but an organizing principle, a specific mode of behavior essentially different to the behavior of an externally worked machine. Since, however, we cannot conceive of a purely spiritual energy except in association with a definite combination of sensible elements through which it reveals itself, we are apt to take this combination as the ultimate ground of spiritual energy. The discoveries of Newton in the sphere of matter and those of Darwin in the sphere of natural history reveal a mechanism. All problems, it was believed, were really the problems of physics. Energy and atoms with the properties self existing in them could explain everything, including life, thought, will, and feeling. The concept of mechanism, a purely physical concept, claimed to be all embracing explanation of nature, and the battle for and against mechanism is still being fiercely fought in the domain of biology. The question then is whether the passage of reality through the revelations of sense perceptions necessarily leads to a view of reality essentially opposed to the view that religion takes of its ultimate character. Is natural science finally committed to materialism? There is no doubt that the theories of science constitute trustworthy knowledge because they are verifiable and enable us to predict and control the events of nature. But we must not forget that what is called science is not a single systematic view of reality. It is a mass of sectional views of reality, fragments of total experience which do not seem to fit together. Natural science deals with matter, with life, and with mind. But the moment you ask the question how matter, life, and mind are actually mutually related, you begin to see the sectional character of the various sciences that deal with them and the inability of these sciences, taken singly, to furnish a complete answer to your question. In fact, the various natural sciences are like so many vultures falling on the dead body of nature, and each running away with a piece of its flesh. Nature, as the subject of science, is a highly artificial affair, and this artificiality is the result of that selective process to which science must subject her in the interests of precision. The moment you put the subject of science in the total of human experience, it begins to disclose a different character. Thus, religion, which demands the whole of reality and for this reason must occupy a central place in any synthesis of all the data of human experience, has no reason to be afraid of any sectional views of reality. Natural science is by nature sectional. It cannot, if it is true to its own nature and function, set up its theory as a complete view of reality. The concepts we use in the organization of knowledge are therefore sectional in character, and their application is relative to the level of experience to which they are applied. The concept of cause, for instance, the essential feature of which is priority to the effect, is relative to the subject matter of physical science, which studies one special kind of activity to the exclusion of other forms of activity observed by others. When we rise to the level of life and mind, the concept of cause fails us. And we stand in need of concepts of a different order of thought. The action of living organisms, initiated and planned in view of an end, is totally different to causal action. The subject matter of our inquiry therefore demands the concepts of end and purpose, which act from within, unlike the concept of cause, which is external to the effect and acts from without. No doubt, there are aspects of the activity of a living organisms which it shares with other objects of nature. In the observation of these aspects, the concepts of physics and chemistry would be needed, but the behavior of the organism is essentially a matter of inheritance and incapable of sufficient explanation in terms of molecular physics. However, the concept of mechanism has been applied to life, and we have to see how far the attempt has succeeded. Unfortunately, I'm not a biologist and must turn to biologists themselves for support. After telling us the main difference between a living organism and a machine is that the former is self maintaining and self reproducing. J.S. Haldane says, it is thus evident that although we find within the living body many phenomena which, so long as we do not look closely, can be interpreted satisfactorily as physical and chemical mechanisms, there are side by side other phenomena, that is, self maintenance and reproduction, for which the possibility of such interpretation seems to be absent. The mechanists assume that the bodily mechanisms are so constructed as to maintain, repair, and reproduce themselves. In the long process of natural selection, mechanisms of this sort have, they suggest, been evolved gradually. Let us examine this hypothesis. When we state an event in mechanical terms, we state it as a necessary result of certain simple properties of separate parts which interact in the event. The essence of the explanation or restatement of the event is that after due investigation, we have assumed that the parts interacting in the event have certain simple and definite properties, so that they always react in the same way under the same conditions. For a mechanical explanation, the reacting parts must first be given. Unless an arrangement of parts with definite properties is given, it is meaningless to speak of mechanical explanation. To postulate the existence of a self producing or self maintaining mechanism is thus to postulate something to which no meaning can be attached. Meaningless terms are sometimes used by psychologists, but there is none so absolutely meaningless as the expression of mechanism of reproduction. Any mechanism there may be in the parent organism is absent in the process of reproduction and must reconstitute itself at each generation. Since the parent organism is reproduced from a mere tiny speck of its own body, there can be no mechanism of reproduction. The idea of a mechanism which is constantly maintaining or reproducing its own structure is self contradictory. A mechanism which reproduced itself would be a mechanism without parts and therefore not a mechanism. Life is, then, a unique phenomenon, and the concept of mechanism is inadequate for its analysis. Its factual wholeness, to use an expression of Driesch, Another notable biologist is a kind of unity which, looked at from another point of view, is also a plurality. In all the purposes processes of growth and adaptation to its environment, whether this adaptation is secured by the formation of flesh or the modification of old habits. It possesses a career which is unthinkable in the case of a machine. And the possession of a career means that the sources of its activity cannot be explained except in reference to a remote past, the origin of which therefore must be sought in a spiritual reality, revealable in but not discoverable by any analysis of spatial experience. It would therefore seem that life is foundational and anterior to the routine of physical and chemical processes, which must be regarded as a kind of fixed behavior formed during a long course of evolution. Further, the application of the mechanistic concepts to life, necessitating the view that the intellect itself is a product of evolution, brings science into conflict with its own objective principle of investigation. On this point, I will quote a passage from Wilden Carr, who has given a very pointed expression to this conflict. If intellect is a product of evolution, the whole mechanistic concept of the nature and origin of life is absurd, and the principle which science has adopted must clearly be revised. We have only to state it to see the self contradiction. How can the intellect, a mode of apprehending reality, be itself an evolution of something which only exists as an abstraction of that mode of apprehending, which is the intellect? If intellect is an evolution of life, then the concept of the life which can evolve intellect as a particular mode of apprehending reality must be the concept of a more concrete activity than that of any abstract mechanical movement which the intellect can present to itself by analyzing its apprehended content. And yet, further, if the intellect be a product of the evolution of life, it is not absolute but relative to the activity of the life which has evolved it. How then, in such case, can science exclude the subjective aspect of the knowing and build on the objective presentation as an absolute? Clearly, the biological sciences necessitate a reconsideration of the scientific principle. I will now try to reach the primacy of life and thought by another route and carry you a step further in our examination of experience. This will throw some further light on the primacy of life and will also give us an insight into the nature of life as a psychic activity. We have seen that Professor Whitehead describes the universe not as something static but as something with a structure of events possessing the character of a continuous creative flow. This quality of nature's passage in time is perhaps the most significant aspect of experience, which the Quran especially emphasizes and which, as I hope to be able to show in a sequel, offers the best clue to the ultimate nature of reality. To some of the verses 3 190 to 191, 2 164, and 24 44, bearing on point I have already drawn your attention. In view of the great importance of the subject, I will add here a few more. Verily, in the alternations of night and of the day, and in that God hath created in the heavens and in the earth, are signs to those who fear him. 10:6. And it is he who hath ordained the night and the day to succeed one another for those who desire to think on God or desire to be thankful. 25:62. Yes, though not that God causeth the night to come in upon the day, and the day to come in upon the night, and that He hath subjected the sun and the moon to laws which by each speedeth along to an appointed goal. 31:29. It is of him that the night returneth on the day, and that the day returneth on the night. 39:5. And of him is the change of the night and of the day. 23:80. There is another set of verses which, indicating the relativity of our reckoning of time, suggests the possibility of unknown levels of consciousness. But I will content myself with the discussion of the familiar yet deeply significant aspect of experience alluded to in the verses quoted above. Among the representatives of contemporary thought, Bergson is the only thinker who has made a keen study of the phenomenon of duration in time. I will first briefly explain to you his view of duration and then point out the inadequacy of his analysis in order to fully bring out the implications of a completer view of the temporal aspect of existence. The ontological problem before us is how to define the ultimate nature of existence. That the universe persists in time is not open to doubt. Yet, since it is external to us, it is possible to be skeptical about its existence. In order completely to grasp the meaning of this persistence in time, we must be in a position to study some privileged case of existence which is absolutely unquestionable and gives us the further assurance of a direct vision of duration. Now, my perception of things that confront me is superficial and external, but my perception of my own self is internal, intimate, and profound. It follows, therefore, that conscious experience is that privileged case of existence in which we are in absolute contact with reality, and an analysis of this privileged case is likely to throw a flood of light on the ultimate meaning of existence. What do I find when I fix my gaze upon my own conscious experience? In the words of Bergson, I pass from state to state. I am warm or cold. I am merry or sad. I work or I do nothing. I look at what is around me or I think of something else. Sensations, feelings, volitions, ideas are such are the changes into which my existence is divided and which color it in turns. I change then without ceasing. Thus, there is nothing static in my inner life. All is a constant mobility, an unceasing flux of states, a perpetual flow in which there is no halt or resting place. Constant change, however, is unthinkable without time. On the analogy of our inner experience, then, conscious existence means life in time. A keener insight into the nature of conscious experience, however, reveals that the self in its inner life moves from the center outwards. It has, so to speak, two sides which may be described as appreciative and efficient. On its efficient side, it enters into relation with what we call the world of space. The efficient self is the subject of associationist psychology. The practical self of daily life in its dealing with the external order of things which determine our passing states of consciousness and stamp on these states their own spatial feature of mutual isolation. The self here lives outside itself, as it were, and while retaining its unity as a totality, discloses itself as nothing more than a series of specific and consequently numerable states. The time in which the efficient self lives is, therefore, the time of which we predicate long and short. It is hardly distinguishable from space. We can conceive it only as a straight line composed of spatial points which are external to one another, like so many stages in a journey. But time thus regarded is not true time, according to Bergson. Existence in spatialized time is spurious existence. A deeper analysis of conscious experience reveals to us what I have called the appreciative side of the self. With our absorption in the external order of things necessitated by our present situation, it is extremely difficult to catch a glimpse of the appreciative self. In our constant pursuit after external things, we weave a kind of veil around the appreciative self, which thus becomes completely alien to us. It is only in the moments of profound meditation, when the efficient self is in abeyance, that we sink into our deeper self and reach the inner center of experience. In the life process of this deeper ego, the states of consciousness melt into each other. The unity of the appreciative ego is like the unity of the germ in which the experiences of its individual ancestors exist, not as a plurality, but as a unity in which every experience permeates the whole. There is no numerical distinctness of the states in the totality of the ego, the multiplicity of whose elements is, unlike that of the efficient self, wholly qualitative. There is change and movement, but change and movement are indivisible. Their elements interpenetrate and are wholly non serial in character. It appears that the time of the appreciative self is a single now, which the efficient self, in its traffic with the world of space, pulverizes into a series of nows like pearl beads in a thread. Here is then pure duration, unadulterated by space. The Quran, with its characteristic simplicity, alludes to the serial and non serial aspects of duration in the following verses. And put thou thy trust in him that liveth and dieth not, and celebrate his praise, who in 6 days created the heavens and the earth, and what is between them. Then mounted his throne, the God of mercy. 25:58 to 59. All things we have created with a fixed destiny. Our command was but one, swift as the twinkling of an eye. 54:49 to 50. If we look at the movement embodied in the creation from the outside, that is to say, if we apprehend it intellectually, it is a process lasting through thousands of years. For one divine day, in the terminology of the Quran, as of the Old Testament, is equal to 1,000 years. From another point of view, the process of creation, lasting through thousands of years, is a single indivisible act, swift as the twinkling of an eye. It is, however, impossible to express this inner experience of pure duration in words, for language is shaped on the serial time of our daily efficient self. Perhaps an illustration will further elucidate the point. According to physical science, the cause of your sensation of red is the rapidity of wave motion, the frequency of which is 400 billions per second. If you could observe this tremendous frequency from the outside and count it at the rate of 2000 per second, which is supposed to be the limit of the perceptibility of life, it will take you more than 6,000 years to finish the enumeration. Yet, in the single momentary mental act of perception, you hold together a frequency of wave motion which is practically incalculable. That is how the mental act transforms succession into duration. The appreciative act, then, is more or less corrective of the efficient self, inasmuch as it synthesizes all the heres and nows, the small changes of space and time, indispensable to the efficient self, into the coherent wholeness of personality. Pure time, then, as revealed by a deeper analysis of our conscious experience, is not a string of separate reversible instants. It is an organic whole in which the past is not left behind, but is moving along with and operating in the present, and the future is given to it not as lying before, yet to be traversed. It is given only in the same sense that it is present in its nature as an open possibility. It is time regarded as an organic whole that the Quran describes as Taqdeer or the destiny, a word which has been so much misunderstood both in and outside the world of Islam. Destiny is time regarded as prior to the disclosure of its possibilities. It is time freed from the net of casual sequence, the diagrammatic character which the logical understanding imposes on it. In one word, it is time as felt and not as thought and calculated. If you ask me why the Emperor Humayun and Shah Tahmasp of Persia were contemporaries, I can give you no casual explanation. The only answer that can possibly be given is that the nature of reality is such that among its infinite possibilities of becoming, the two possibilities known as the lives of Humayun and Tahmasp should realize themselves together. Time regarded as destiny forms the very essence of things. As the Quran says, God created all things and assigned to each its destiny. The destiny of a thing, then, is not an unrelenting fate working from without like a taskmaster. It is the inward reach of a thing, its realizable possibilities which lie within the depths of its nature and serially actualize themselves without any feeling of external compulsion. Thus, the organic wholeness of duration does not mean that full fledged events are lying, as it were, in the womb of reality and drop one by one like the grains of sand from the hourglass. If time is real and not a mere repetition of homogeneous moments which make conscious experience a delusion, then every moment in the life of reality is original, giving birth to what is absolutely novel and unforeseeable. Every day doeth some new work employ him, says the Quran. To exist in real time is not to be bound by the fetters of serial time, but to create it from moment to moment and to be absolutely free and original in creation. In fact, all creative activity is free activity. Creation is opposed to repetition, which is a characteristic of mechanical action. That is why it is impossible to explain the creative activity of life in terms of mechanism. Science seeks to establish uniformities of experience, that is, the laws of mechanical repetition. Life, with its intense feeling of spontaneity, constitutes a center of indetermination and thus falls outside the domain of necessity. Hence, science cannot comprehend life. The biologist who seeks a mechanical explanation of life is led to do so because he confines his study to the lower forms of life whose behavior discloses resemblances to mechanical action. If he studies life as manifested in himself, that is, his own mind, freely choosing, rejecting, reflecting, surveying the past and the present, and dynamically imagining the future, he is sure to be convinced of the inadequacy of his mechanical concepts. On the analogy of our conscious experience, then, the universe is a free creative movement, but how can we conceive a movement independent of a concrete thing that moves? The answer is that the notion of things is derivative. We can derive things from movement, we cannot derive movement from immobile things. If, for instance, we suppose material atoms such as the atoms of Democritus to be the original reality, we must import movement into them from the outside as something alien to their nature. Whereas if we take movement as original, static things may be derived from it. In fact, physical science has reduced all things to movement. The essential nature of the atom in modern science is electricity and not something electrified. Apart from this, things are not given in immediate experience as things already possessing definite contours of immediate experience in a continuity without any distinctions in it. What we call things are events in the continuity of nature, which thought spatializes and thus regards as mutually isolated for purposes of action. The universe, which seems to us to be a collection of things, is not a solid stuff occupying a void. It is not a thing but an act. The nature of thought, according to Bergson, is serial. It cannot deal with movement except by viewing it as series of stationary points. It is therefore the operation of thought working with static concepts that gives the appearance of serial immobilities to what is essentially dynamic in its nature. The coexistence and succession of these immobilities is the source of what we call space and time.